San Francisco, 1906. Will Irwin, the journalist, had described it before the great calamity as the gayest, lightest-hearted, most pleasure-loving city of the Western continent.
Willie Britt, a fight manager, said, "I'd rather be a busted lamppost on Battery Street, San Francisco, than the Waldorf Astoria in New York." Rudyard Kipling said of this place, "San Francisco is a mad city, inhabited by perfectly insane people, whose women are of remarkable beauty." 400,000 people lived in this city. It was the 9th largest in the nation and the biggest in the West. Her people hailed from all over the world.
The President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, had come here in the spring of 1903. The Golden Gate Band played patriotic tunes. 50,000 school children cheered along Van Ness Avenue. Here, Mr. Roosevelt said, was the garden of the Lord and the West of the West.
In the West of the West, no one dreamed that San Francisco would soon be destroyed. The big quake of 1865 was just a distant memory, an amusing part of the city folklore. The city had practically burned to the ground 6 times in its early days, but this legacy, too, seemed safely in the past. The modern fire department was believed to be invincible. Many of the people who put their faith in the city were newcomers. 1/3 of the population had been born on foreign soil. Another third were the children of immigrants.
When my father arrived here from Italy, he immediately got a job out on Fillmore Street. Our store was directly across from a bakery known as the Wycree Bakery. My mother arrived and found a job right near where my dad was working. He delivered the vegetables and she probably opened the back door. So that's how they met.
For the thousands of people who had disembarked at her wharves since the days of the gold rush, San Francisco was a magnet, a kind of promised land at the end of the rainbow. The first home for many on American soil was in the district called South of Market. Here were cheap wood tenements packed side by side like a house of cards. They would be the first to burn.
And them little streets were like colonies, really. All the Irish would settle in one little neighborhood, and the Dutch would settle in another neighborhood, and the Jews would settle in another neighborhood, and it was just a neighborly party. Everybody knew everybody else.
North of Market was a city within the city. 20,000 Chinese lived here.
Chinatown was very circumscribed in that it was only about 5 square blocks at that time. And we're not supposed to wander beyond Powell Street or Broadway on the north.
The Chinese ghetto was portrayed by the popular press as a barbaric and dangerous place, whose inhabitants worshiped pagan gods and indulged in fantastical vices. They ate strange foods and lived in a world cloaked in mystery and secrecy. On the inside, it was rather less romantic. A few were influential merchants, traders of silks, tea, and cheap human labor. Chinese laborers had started coming to California around the time of the gold rush. Gold Mountain Men, they were called, back home in Canton.
In San Francisco, they became workers in sweatshops, servants in the houses of the rich.
There was an invisible wall around Chinatown, a wall of racial prejudice.
Like my parents, the minute they landed in San Francisco from China, they just stayed in Chinatown and hardly ever get out of Chinatown. And one time, as a little boy, I wandered beyond Pacific Avenue, and I was beaten by some Italian boys. We knew that we were hated as a people, and so we generally tried to stay aloof and be by ourselves.
Just a few minutes' walk and half a world away from Chinatown was the Palace Hotel. If you had the money, when you came to town, it was the place to stay. There was cut glass and marble in every corridor, and the incredible luxury of telephones and bathtubs in every room. There was also the most modern system of fire alarms and sprinklers.
The palace was built to be indestructible, but so was the Titanic.
Enrico Caruso, the famous opera singer, checked in here the night before the quake. He arrived with 54 steamer trunks and 50 self-portraits. That evening, Caruso stepped on stage to sing Don Jose in Carmen in San Francisco's Grand Opera House. If you couldn't get tickets to the opera, you could go to a gala costume carnival on skates where Miss Floria was crowned the Queen of the Rollers. In the district called the Barbary Coast, Nickelodeon showed scandalous moving pictures.
The coast was described by one indignant critic as
that sink of moral pollution, whose reefs are strewn with human wrecks. Here, blear-eyed men drink vile liquor, smoke offensive tobacco, and engage in vulgar conduct. Here are debauchery, disease, insanity, blasphemy, death, and hell, yawning to receive the putrid mass.
The men on the vice squad were ever vigilant, provided no one paid them not to be.
The mayor of San Francisco, Eugene Schmitz, was a front man for a corrupt city boss. The board of supervisors were content to receive their portion of the bribes. It was said they were so eager to better their position, they would eat the paint off a house.
This was City Hall.
But serious business was done in a little pub on the south side of Market. There, city politicians wheeled and dealed with those who needed favors and who could afford to pay for them.
They were all crooks. There was not a graft going on in them days, but people took it for granted. Everybody was grafting, so it didn't make any difference.
Schmitz and his cronies controlled the grandest city west of the Mississippi. A few dozen big hotels, offices, and banks were built of bricks, steel, and masonry. Most everything else was built of wood. San Francisco was a city waiting to burn. In 1906, the fire alarm, the response, the men and the equipment worked exactly the way they are portrayed in this early silent film.
Everything was automatic in the firehouse. The lights lit on the first strike of the bell. When the bell hit, the lights lit, that let go. The horses moved out under the collars. They snapped the collars. The driver's in the seat, and they're on the street. They were very fast.
But in spite of everything, in spite of San Francisco's 38 steam engine companies, 320 horses, and 584 firemen, who had already distinguished themselves as the city's homegrown heroes, the fire department would be hard-pressed to face the coming disaster. Just months before the earthquake, the National Board of Fire Underwriters stated in a report, San Francisco has violated all underwriting precedents by not burning up. That it has not done so already is largely due to the vigilance of the fire department, which cannot be relied upon to indefinitely stave off the inevitable.
The underwriters were about to be proven correct.
I was sleeping with my mother, and we thought it was the end of the world. We grabbed each other and pulled the covers over our heads and said, "This is the end of the world." And of course, we were scared to death.
We tried to stand up or do something, but we couldn't. We had to hang on for dear life because, as I said, the bed was flying around the room like a kite.
We tried to get out the back kitchen door onto our porch, but the chimney was broken down and the bricks were all against the door. We couldn't get out.
Angelo Santo, Signore, custode mio, io e te. Ave Maria, piena di grazia. Signore con te, tu sei benedetta fra le donne, benedetto
The quake hit San Francisco on Wednesday, April 18th, at precisely 12 minutes past 5 o'clock in the morning. But San Francisco wasn't the only place to get hit. For more than 200 miles along the San Andreas Fault, the crust of the earth slipped as much as 21 feet. In San Jose, 8,000 people were homeless. Santa Rosa, a town of 7,000, was leveled. Trees were uprooted, fences curved, and in some places the earth flowed like water. The quake had the impact of 6 million tons of TNT. Roughly 12,000 times the power of the atomic bomb exploded over Hiroshima. It remains the greatest natural disaster suffered by a North American city. Back in San Francisco, in the hours just after the quake, people wandered the streets in confusion. They had a singular hurt expression, remarked one observer, as if a good friend had suddenly wronged them. In some districts, people had no idea of the amount of damage that had been done. At Valencia Station, commuters waited impatiently for a train that would never come. Others, including Sam Fay, set out and walked to work.
But when I got there, the building stood like a drunken man there, and the boss was there, and he says, "Sam, would you mind standing here and watching the building?" I says, "It's no use watching it." I says, there's nothing to steal.
And there were people walking along, while some with wheelbarrows and their clothes, and some with the parrots and the canaries and what have you, anything they could carry. Even saw a guy rolling a barrel of whiskey along.
The number of people killed by the earthquake was not yet known or even guessed at, but it was clear that many of the worst casualties were in the neighborhoods south of Market. An estimated 30 to 80 people were crushed in the Valencia Hotel. Sam Fay was there.
A fellow come out of the third floor, stark splinter naked, not a stitch on him, out of the window. And he stood there on the fire escape. And I went over to one of the firemen. I says, you better see what you can do with that poor devil, because he's liable to get hurt. It didn't take 5 minutes since that fellow got out of there, when the whole floor, everything crashed into the basement with a roar. God, what a noise that made. They had a big party the night before there, and the majority was still asleep, so they slept there for good.
And my mother kept telling the children, she says, I just have a feeling something happened to your father. And about a half an hour later, my mother sees the horse and wagon coming back. And driven by a strange person. So my mother knew then that that was the end. And she got the news that my father had been killed in the quake.
All over the Mission District, tenements folded in like pasteboard. From the wreckage, the cries of the trapped and injured could be heard. Those who survived could not be helped at the city's hospitals, which had sustained major damage in the quake. They were taken to the dance hall, where only last night Miss Floria had reigned as the roller queen.
I rode around with my father. I sat next to the driver on the driver's seat while he went around with his wagon looking for injured people who had not been found. And then we couldn't find Nellie after that. Nellie was the horse. And I was crying. Where is Nellie? Where is Nellie? I never have learned what happened to Nellie. Never have learned.
What no one yet realized that morning was that the greatest tragedy of San Francisco was yet to unfold. The shock had snapped gas mains and toppled chimneys. 50 fires had started almost simultaneously. Although the city's telephone and central alarm system were destroyed, the individual fire brigades flew into action. But when they arrived on the scene, there was no water. The quake had broken almost all water mains coming into the city. Hydrants gave off a trickle and then ran dry. By 7 a.m., Mayor Schmitz had received status reports from the police and fire departments. Half a dozen fires were raging out of control. The mayor issued a proclamation stating that looters would be shot on sight. He also deputized special police whose actions would later be questioned. But the real power lay in the hands of Brigadier General Frederick Funston, the ranking Army officer in San Francisco. Funston commandeered automobiles and mustered troops. By 8 a.m., more than 1,700 men had arrived downtown. Their orders were to fight the fire, evacuate citizens, and prevent crimes.
But in the chaos that followed, the soldiers themselves were seen looting.
By the time troops were patrolling the streets, a good part of the city was in flames. At about 9 a.m., someone living in the Hayes Valley section kindled a fire to cook breakfast, innocent of the fact that the quake had damaged their chimney. This was the result. By noon, the Ham and Eggs fire, as it came to be known, was on its way to claiming a good part of the city.
My friend and me, we took a hike over between 4th and 5th on Folsom Street because there was a little wooden church was burning. Flames were just shooting up, and we stood watching that little church burning. It was horrible.
The fire was really off and running by this time. So we found, we got down to a building that was going, and I can recall the chief who was in command yelling that the front of the building was coming out. The wall was collapsing. So a police officer decided that what we were doing down there wasn't the right, proper place to be. And he said, "Where are you from?" We said, "Telegraph, it'll go on home." They had to send us back up the hill.
It was believed many of the modern office buildings could withstand the flames. Most prominent, the Call building, one of America's first skyscrapers. The Call caught shortly after 10:30 a.m. It burned from the top down, its elevator shafts acting like flues. A few firemen were trapped on the upper floors and incinerated. About this time, Funston decided that the only hope of stopping the destruction was to use dynamite to create a fire break. At 1 p.m., a demolition team raced across Market to blow up the Monadnock building. The dynamite didn't work. All that was accomplished was to gut the interior of the building without bringing it down. Around the corner, a telegraph operator tapped out San Francisco's last message to the outside world.
2:30 p.m. The city practically ruined by fire. It's within half a block of us. The Call building is burned out entirely. The Examiner building just fell in a heap. Fire all around us, in every direction. Destruction by earthquake, something frightful. They are blowing up standing buildings that are in the path of flames with dynamite. No water. It's awful. I want to get out of here, or be blown up.
By 3 p.m., all telegraph lines were down. The city was isolated. Black powder and dynamite in the hands of inexperienced men often spread the fire rather than contained it.
All day long, you hear those dynamite going bing, bing, bang, bang, you know, all over. We always thought that was a big waste.
Next to the Monadnock was the palace, where Caruso had spent the night. It withstood the flames until 3:30, when its special sprinkler system ran dry. Bartenders gave away bottles of fine wine, while National Guardsmen made a last-ditch effort to save the hotel. By 5 p.m., it was gone. Towards the afternoon, in certain parts of the city, the fire began to assume the characteristics of a firestorm. The fire generated its own superheated wind, which caused spontaneous combustion. A police officer described seeing a tongue of flame catch 3 people. It crackled like a million firecrackers, he said, and it was low to the ground. The flames seemed to pass through them. When it had gone, they were just balls of fire on the ground.
I remember seeing the fire, and, you know, all around it was smoke and everything. I remember looking at the sun or a moon. I don't remember whether the sun or moon. It was very red. And I remember having nightmares for a long time, remembering that all that redness in the moon or sun.
The fire, by late afternoon, had not only cut San Francisco off from the rest of the world, all lines of communication within the city were severed. Untrained deputies guarded banks and stores and took the law into their own hands. And soldiers patrolled the streets without the commanding officers. By nightfall, they had evacuated thousands of people.
Very soon, we had people knocking at our door and wanting to come in because they wanted people to get out, evacuate. And there were soldiers, and we had to get out. And they led us to Washington Square, and we were put up there, and just assigned a place where we were to be in that section.
In the panic, soldiers barred many from saving their possessions hours before the fires reached their district.
One fellow says, I'm going to take a hike over Market Street. And the soldier told him, no, you're not. Nobody goes over Market Street. He says, who's going to stop me? And the soldier says, I will. Because if you insist on going, I put a bullet through you.
Kids who were found looting were spared but publicly humiliated. They were forced to wear placards proclaiming their crime. Later, there would be persistent reports of shootings.
We got down to Broadway, and we heard somebody screaming up there. We walked back there, and the guys started running, and then of course the sentry was after and said, halt, otherwise I'll shoot. So he shot because he wouldn't halt, see?
Towards evening, a young newspaper reporter named Jack London surveyed the scene. I knew it was all doomed, he wrote. I walked for miles and miles through empty blocks. In the intense heat of the city, 2 troopers sat on their horses and watched. Surrender was complete.